Alrighty everyone, so this is our last video for Module 3A, which is discussing optimizing memory and providing a review of Chapter 6 of your textbook. And in this particular video, I am going to talk about learning styles and brain training games. So unlike in previous videos in this module where I have focused on techniques that are effective or techniques that do promote better memory, in this particular video I'm going to talk about common tips and tricks that people use that they think are effective, but in actuality, if we look at the scientific evidence, they are not effective. So we're going to focus on what doesn't work in terms of strategies to promote encoding, storage, and retrieval of information in memory. So the first ineffective technique that I'm going to talk about is the notion of learning styles. So I'm sure from the time that all of you were very little, perhaps in elementary school, you were told maybe by your teacher or even by your parents that you had a particular learning style. So according to the theory of learning styles, we all have particular preferences, okay? And if those preferences are met during instruction, our ability to remember that information or learn that information is going to be facilitated, right? So we have visual learners, and if you're a visual learner, supposedly you prefer to use pictures and diagrams, whereas if you are a musical or auditory learner, you prefer to use sounds and rhythm to help you learn. If you're a verbal learner, you prefer to use words and speech. If you are a social learner, you prefer to be a part of a group when you learn something new, and so on. So there are supposedly many different styles of learning to which your educator can tailor their instruction for your general benefit, is the idea. So if we wanted to look at a concrete definition of what a learning style is, the term learning styles refers to the concept that individuals differ in regard to what mode of instruction is most appropriate for them. And proponents of this learning style theory contend that optimal instruction requires diagnosing individuals' learning style and tailoring instruction accordingly. So we call this the meshing hypothesis, the idea that if we assess people's learning styles and adjust our instruction accordingly, their ability to remember the information that's given to them is going to be better than if we don't teach to their specific learning style. Okay, so these are some of the assessment tools that proponents of learning style theory use. So typically assessments of learning style are going to ask people to evaluate what sort of information presentation they prefer. So for example, do you prefer words versus pictures or speech? And they also ask them not just preferences, but also what kind of mental activity they find most engaging or most pleasant, right? So do you like to paint, or do you like to read, or what are your favorite activities to engage in? And there's all sorts of different measurement instruments that are used, but the most common, again, are based on the meshing hypothesis that if we match people's preferences to our instruction, their learning is going to be better. right? So they might say I use diagrams, pictures, or mind maps, in which we would assume they were a visual learner. I often fidget and want to move around, in which case we would assume that they're a kinesic learner. I use rhymes or music, so we would assume that they were an auditory learner. And I learn best when I discuss my work with someone else, in which case they would be a social learner. Right, but where is the evidence, right? So I'm sure that you guys, even in the third week of taking this course, have realized the importance of evaluating claims in terms of the scientific evidence that's available, right? So anytime we can, it's really going to be important to talk about research findings that seem to corroborate any theory of cognition that we talk about. So what is the state of the scientific evidence here? How can we scientifically assess the claim that students will learn best when instructional techniques match their individual learning styles, right? Well, I have two examples of research studies or experiments that were conducted here that I can share with you. Okay, so for the first one, for the 2002 study, essentially what they did is they divided participants into visual and verbal learners based on their self-reported preferences. So they gave them an assessment very similar to the one that you guys just saw. And then they asked them to complete a computer-based electronics lesson with two different help screens. So again, they were studying some aspect of electronics, and they were either in the visual condition, given diagrams and illustrations to help them, or in the verbal condition, they were provided with supplementary text. And what they found in this particular experiment is that there was no benefit. So when they were subsequently tested on the content that they learned in the lesson, there was no difference between individuals who were visual learners who had gotten visual help screens as compared to visual learners who got verbal help screens, right? So it made no difference on a subsequent test whether the help screen matched their preferences. It didn't matter if visual learners got visual help screens and verbal learners got verbal help screens, or vice versa, right? So matching their preferences when giving them a help screen made no difference at all, right? So that seems to be pretty compelling evidence against this meshing hypothesis. And in the second study, in the 2006 study, they did the same thing. So they divided participants based on whether they identified as a visual or verbal learner. And there were three experimental conditions. So in the auditory presentation condition, words were presented over a loudspeaker. In the visual presentation condition, words were presented as line drawings. And in the both condition, they saw some pictures and some words that were presented auditorially. Okay? And what they found is that all participants recalled more of the words that were presented. So all participants recalled more words in the visual presentation condition, regardless of preference, right? So even if you identified as a verbal learner, seeing pictures resulted in better memory for the words than just hearing the word over the loudspeaker, right? So those are two fairly compelling reasons why we should call into question this notion of the meshing hypothesis, or that learning styles, tailoring to someone's learning style is going to help them remember things. Okay, so why is it, given the evidence that I just reviewed, that learning styles are still so widely endorsed, right? So, for example, if I were to pull up the website for Yale's School of Education, it would, I believe, as of I think 2007 or so, it actually had a section directed to its students in that particular program that talked about the benefits of learning styles. And in fact, when I first started teaching at Mercer, one of our professional development workshops was talking about learning styles. So why is it that this particular doctrine is so attractive, even though there's no evidence to support it? Well, one of the reasons is going back to something I've already talked about in this module, which is the idea that a lot of people operate under the assumption that if learning is effective, then it should feel easy, right? So if I'm learning something in the right way, then it shouldn't be challenging, right? But as we've already discovered in our time together in this module, a lot of the most effective study strategies are those that produce the most difficult conditions, right? So if we go back to our comparing of simply rereading a textbook, right? When you reread a textbook chapter 3 times in a row, right? By the time you get to the end of the chapter, that third time, that information is going to feel really, really accessible to you, right? It's going to be very highly activated in your short-term memory. And so you're going to feel like you know the information. And the act of rereading, passively rereading something is fairly easy, right? But if we look at what you remember from that chapter a week later, okay, chances are not much, right? As compared to maybe reading a textbook chapter for 20 minutes and then being tested on it or taking several successive tests, right? You're going to feel like a lot of that information from the chapter you no longer remember, right? But as we would see a week later, right, taking those successive tests is going to allow you to remember what you have retained pretty much indefinitely, right? Similarly, cramming, if you study the same information over the course of 8 hours, at the end of that 8 hours, it's going to be very accessible and you're going to feel like you know it very, very well, as opposed to studying it for 1 hour each night for 8 nights. There's going to be a lot of forgetting, a lot of interference that happens in between study sessions. And so you're going to have to work a lot harder to retrieve that information than you would if you were just studying it for an extended period of time, right? So all of that again suggests that the best memory performance happens often under the most difficult conditions. So the idea that the most effective learning should be easy is simply not supported. But a lot of people believe that that is true. Another reason why people seem to want to endorse the idea of learning styles is because we like to differentiate ourselves from our peers, right? If you spend any time on Facebook at all, right, you'll see the prevalence of those quizzes, right? So you can answer 10 random questions about yourself and then find out whether you're a poodle or a chihuahua or whatever, right? So even when it's totally arbitrary, we seem to want to affix a sort of unique label to ourselves, right? So we want to think about ourselves as maybe being different from our peers. If we're a movement-based learner and most of our peers are visual learners, right? That gives us something that distinguishes us from them. Another reason why people are more likely to believe this idea of learning styles is because it places responsibility for learning not on the learner or not on the student, but on the instructor, right? So, for example, if you have a child who is not doing well in their courses, um, it might be difficult to think about your child not living up to your expectations. That might be stressful or anxiety producing for you. So in an effort to combat that anxiety, right, maybe it's easier to think about the classroom not being tailored or instruction not being tailored to the needs of your child, and that's why they're not succeeding. Okay, so that concludes our discussion of learning styles. And really quickly, I wanted to talk about another widespread learning tool that doesn't have any scientific evidence to support it. And that is the idea of brain training games. So these aren't quite as common as they used to be, but about 10 years ago, 5-10 years ago, there used to be tons of commercials marketing various products, various programs. I think Luminosity was one of them, and it was basically an app that you could subscribe to, and they argued that if you played this particular game for X number of minutes a day for X amount of time, that you would basically train your brain to be better at human cognition. So you would see improvements in your memory, in your ability to sustain your attention, in your thinking, problem solving, right? All of those higher level cognitions. And so obviously this was a really attractive idea, particularly to individuals who had suffered some kind of significant brain injury. So individuals who had suffered a stroke, individuals with Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's or Huntington's chorea, or any condition that results in a gradual loss of cognitive function. So what happened is a lot of doctors and a lot of programs that worked with these specialized populations started to purchase these programs. And in fact, people spent millions and millions of dollars making these programs widely available to these patients. And these patients took time away from their families and from their other sort of cognitive rehab activities to play these games. And what they found, much to their happiness, was that if they played these games for X number of minutes for so long, their performance would improve on these games, or their scores would go up. And so what these companies would say is, as your score goes up, you're training your brain, right? Your cognitive faculties are improving. But when cognitive psychologists, when neuropsychologists actually tested that, right? So when they compared all kinds of things, so when they administered batteries of tests, looking at memory and attention and all of these higher level cognitions, and they compared people who were playing these brain training games to other control groups. So people who were doing other sorts of cognitive rehab or who weren't engaging in any sort of activity to improve their cognition. They found virtually no difference. So there was virtually no difference between individuals who had purchased these games and were regularly playing them as compared to individuals who had not. So again, in this particular case, the stakes are fairly high, right? Because these are often progressive conditions that are degenerative. And so you might imagine if you only have so much more time left, and you only have so many resources you can devote to treating your particular condition, that if you were to devote millions of dollars and several hours of time throughout your now limited life to playing this game in the hopes that you would achieve some kind of gain and then not achieve that gain, it's very, very unfortunate, right? So this is yet another example of something that's widespread and widely believed to be effective that actually has no scientific evidence in support of it. Okay, so this is the last video for Module 3A. And all of the other videos for Module 3B have been uploaded. So if you guys have any questions for me, feel free to reach out and I will see you in my next video.